So I've been out in the bus doing just a few small projects, no one big thing underway just yet. I have been meaning to build this front couch, kind of fold out couch system, but it's been really cold out here and tough to do any real building projects, and I've also just been swamped at work. But I have been getting kind of a steady array of questions from my previous videos and posts on social media, and those questions have been kind of grouping up around a few topics. So I thought I'd address those just to give you my answers and my approach to converting this old prison bus. And let me just say that there's definitely no one way to do a schoolie. Some people live in these things full time, for others it's like a weekend kind of thing. So my approach is totally my own, and I would say that you've got to really think about what you're going to use your bus for as you make decisions about your electrical system, your plumbing, and even just the layout in terms of how many people you have and what your plans are. Alright, so the first question that I want to address that I've been getting a lot of is a pretty simple one, and one I haven't really talked about at all because I didn't think it was important, but I keep getting asked, what kind of screws and fasteners are you using? Alright, so it's pretty simple. I think it's safe to say I've been using like three different kinds of screws for different situations on the bus. Self-tapping screws, wood screws, and deck screws. So self-tapping screws like this one are just like they sound. They're screws that will actually tap into the metal that you're screwing into, and that's because, and I think you can see this here, that's because a self-tapping screw has these little grooves on the front of it, and those grooves kind of eat away the metal as it goes around and around. Now this is an unusual self-tapping screw. This is a gasketed roofing screw, and you can buy huge bags of these things, like with like 400 screws, 300 screws for about 15 bucks. So I think these self-tapping gasketed roofing screws are cheaper than most other self-tapping screws. Anyway, I've been using a lot of these on the bus for things that don't bear a load, that don't need any shear strength. So screws don't have the best shear strength compared to nails and other fasteners, but on a bus, the reason I've been using so many screws is that there's less chance of a screw kind of wiggling loose than a nail or a brad. So yeah, I've been using these self-tapping roofing screws. They're gasketed. In some instances, I've actually pulled the gasket off, and they're pretty sweet. You usually don't need to drill a hole before you tap these into your metal, but on some of the thicker gauge steel, it does take a pre-drilled hole. Alright, another screw kind of moving up in size that I've been using are just simple wood screws. For all the cabinetry and attaching paneling and things like that, I've been using wood screws, and I just always have a set of wood screws of different sizes in my kit. So I've got 2 inch, inch and a half, inch and a quarter, 1 inch, depending on the application. And then the other one that is essential to me, like I use this all the time doing framing in a situation like this, are these big old 3 inch or 3.5 inch deck screws. Again, not the best shear strength compared to a big old nail, but these deck screws are really key for making connections between framing members, like 2 2x4s, locking those guys together, or I've been using these to attach 2x4s to the ceiling of the bus, and getting a pretty good solid connection. That's because I have this perforated acoustical ceiling, and those deck screws just eat right through it and make a good solid connection. I guess the last thing I'll say about screws is that for me, cost is an issue. I've been reusing a lot of stuff that I've just got in my shop from previous projects, but you can really kill a lot of money buying expensive screws, and I've tried to keep it cheap by reusing stuff and then also using those roofing screws, which I had left over, but you can get more affordably than small packs of self-tapping screws. Alright, so the next comment and question I've been getting from a ton of people has to do with insulation on my bus. Alright, so a lot of people who have converted schoolies have really insulated the heck out of them. Stripped out all the wall paneling, all the metal wall paneling, all the ceilings, all the floors, put in 2-inch insulation foam core on the floor, and either rock wool or fiberglass spats on the walls, or spray foam, and insulated the ceiling. And I get that. I know that a lot of people are planning to be living in their schoolie year round and want this thing to be super insulated and super tight. My bus has insulation already in the walls. It's not the best, but it is insulated. And my main addition to the insulation was on the floor, where I put in a thin sheet of foam insulation underneath my subfloor. That's just because the floor had no insulation. The walls have some insulation and the ceiling has insulation. I'm not saying it's the best, but I decided to just go with that existing structure of insulation, mainly because I don't see us living in this bus full time. I instead see it as more of like a road trip mobile and a vacation machine, a bus that we can take to festivals and things like that. So I did not go whole hog insulating this bus. Now, a few people have noticed that I've created some cavities on the bus with my paneling and in my cabinetry, and those cavities could use some insulation. So I am going to retrofit some insulation into those cavities, mainly because whenever you create a cavity, and I've been learning this, you create kind of like an acoustical box that's going to be noisy. And so I've got no problem putting some fiberglass insulation in those cavities to keep the noise down. Road noise in this bus is pretty serious. You know, I've got the engine up front. This is not a dog-nosed bus. I've got the engine right next to the driver, and that thing is loud when you're running. Like, it is hard to have a conversation in here when you're on the road. So it's a noisy bus, and I don't want to add to that noise. So I will dampen a bit. But as for insulation, I would say that the biggest liability in terms of R value in a bus like this are all the windows. I mean, these windows are not double pane, but I'm not at all interested in taking these windows out. I love all the windows in the bus. It brings in so much light, and it's not actually a very big space to heat. So even though it's gappy and a little bit chilly, heating this bus, even with the space heater, is not a problem. So that is the story with insulation on my prison bus. I would encourage you to go your own way with insulating your bus if you have a bus, just because, you know, it really depends on where you're going to be living in it, or if you're going to be living in it, how many people, what your use is, what your heat source is, etc. Alright, so the third thing I've been getting kind of like a cluster of questions around is my wiring electrical system. And similar to my other answers, I'll say that I just did it my way based on what I wanted to do with this bus. Okay, so basically my electrical system is a simple 110 alternating current system that you can run off shore power. Plug the bus in and all my outlets are live and most of my lights are live. So that's my main system. I also have a leisure battery on this bus that is completely kaput. It's an old battery that's shot, but I do have a leisure battery, and that battery charges off the alternator. I'm also going to charge that guy through my shore power by converting the alternating current to direct current. So anyway, that's my system. It's a pretty simple one. I know a lot of people with these schoolies have gone for solar, which is awesome. I didn't want to go for that expense, and I just don't know if I'm going to use the bus enough to justify a solar setup. But anyway, a lot of people go with solar, and a lot of people go with a big bank of leisure batteries because they really want to be boondocking off-grid or not connected to shore power for a long time. I just don't see that being a big issue with this bus. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but the deal is that for years and years I have taken long road trips, usually in the summer, living out of my car or my truck. We camp, we backpack and do all that without a bus with power, without a power source at all. So for me, it's not really a big deal to be without electricity when we're on the road. You know, you can cool your food in a cooler, keep it cool in a cooler. And you know, we have a camp stove and we can run really self-sufficiently without power. It's just not a big deal for us. So if we don't have power in a boondocking situation, that's just not going to be a huge deal. We've got solar powered power banks for our electronics, and that's just, you know, enough. So for me, that's the way I wanted to set this bus up, was with the ability to plug it in offshore power and really run a full array just like a house or a tiny house. But when we're not plugged into shore power, it's definitely going to have limited electricity, a limited power, because there's just one leisure battery. Alright, another question I've had a few times is what's up with the conduit that I've been running my power lines through, my electrical lines through. And let me just address that. This bus is metal. It conducts electricity. There was no way in heck I was going to run my Romex or my 12-volt electrical lines next to the metal body of this bus. There's just no way. I know I'm using coated wire, but one coating, you know, that rubber outer coating on a Romex wire or on 12-volt wire that I've been running, that one coating for me just isn't enough insurance against arcing between the wire and the bus. And I do not want to power up the walls of this bus and electrify the bus. So what I did is I ran all my wire in plastic non-conducting conduit. Now, Romex isn't supposed to go in conduit, and in the Uniform Building Code, you'll get dinged in a house inspection if you run your Romex inside of conduit, just because of heat buildup. So what I did is I got sort of larger conduit that has plenty of airspace. So there's airspace for my wires inside the conduit. Everything's in conduit. It's safer, I think, and a little bit more organized. I know other people are tacking their Romex to their framing. Cool, man, like do it how you do it, but my approach was to use conduit to keep that wire off, like seriously off the metal walls of the bus. And then one more wiring question that I've had a couple times from a few different people is just what wire I'm using. You should probably check out a wiring gauge chart. A gauge chart will tell you over the run of your wire, depending on the length of your run, you'll want to adjust your gauge. Now, as a simple rule of thumb, most interior receptacle wiring and lighting wiring is run on a 12-2 wire. 12-2 is the yellow Romex. And it's just kind of like your standard Romex for running receptacles and lights. So I mainly use 12-2 yellow Romex to run my shore power system. I did use some 14-3, which is a slightly thinner gauge wire that's usually only used for lights and like smoke alarms and things like that. I use that 14-3 because I have a couple three-way lights on my shore power. So I've got a switch up front and a switch in back to run some of my lights. So I've got some 14-3, but it's almost all just 12-2 yellow Romex, straight up stuff. And then my 12-volt system is just single strands of a solid 12-volt wire. Now, I know there is debate about solid wire strength versus stranded wire strength. Yes, stranded wire is reportedly stronger than solid wire, and some people worry about, you know, your bus bouncing around on the road and those wires breaking. I'm not that worried about it. You know, everything's in conduit or tacked and seems pretty solid to me. If I do have breaks in the wire, it's pretty easy to pull out of conduit because, you know, you can pull a run from one end to the other where it's exposed and pull that wire right out of the conduit. It's not tacked in place permanently or anything like that. Alright, so those are some answers to just commonly asked questions I've been getting about my bus. So thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, all that stuff. You can follow me on Instagram if you don't already. I post photos about what I'm working on, and those usually come out ahead of my videos. And on Patreon, I also keep a sort of blog about what's going on with the projects that I do.